Now that we have finished up with Priest, of course, my favorite class, I'm just going to sort of go through the other cards in, I guess, alphabetical order. How about that? So, their Auction Master Beardo. This is kind of an interesting card, you know, doesn't have an obvious use when you initially read it. It's like, okay, you can use your hero power multiple times, but you have to do something in order to use your hero power multiple times. You have to be able to keep casting spells and want to use your hero power a lot. You know, what's going on with that? Well, for one, you don't have to necessarily do too much with it because it's a 3/4 for 3, which is pretty decent stat-wise to begin with. Two, there are two things that jump out at me when I think about using my hero power multiple times. Number one is Inspire. Obviously, lots of powerful things with Inspire if you're able to use them multiple times in a turn. There's stuff like the Kodo Rider, the Confessor Paeltris, even Tournament Medic. You know, I played the essentially an Inspire deck for a long time. That's very, very powerful. I did use just Garrison Commander for a while, and it's not a card you necessarily want to have in your control decks because it doesn't really contest the board very well, but an Auction Master Beardo can often replicate that and give you additional value with those Inspire cards. Well, number two, as far as use is concerned for multiple hero powers, the other thing that deck was built around, which is Shadow Form. I was, you know, a huge fan of playing Shadow Priest, and particularly the Reno Shadow Priest deck that I messed around with for a long time prior to the release of the standard format. And being able to hero power multiple times is obviously much more powerful when your hero power is super good. And that's exactly what Shadow Form offers. And often the Shadow Form deck would have, at least in sort of a modern version I envision it, the desire to have significant number of spells to power up your additional healing stuff, like, say, Priest of the Feast, which is another new inclusion into that strategy that didn't exist back in the day, that you don't necessarily have to just rely on Reno Jackson for your big late game heal. It also turns out Priest is in the Cabal and could potentially use Kazakus in all of this, so you can find some additional flexibility with the spell that you get from Kazakus. Maybe you can get a cheap one to use with Beardo if you need multiple hero power activations. The uses go on. So this is, you know, obviously a very niche kind of exploration. What do I do with this type of card? But it's definitely a card that I'm looking at experimenting with, you know, obviously in those two ways, with Inspire, with Shadow Form, and quite likely with both. So we may see the return of Reno Shadow Priest in the near future. Next we have kind of a simple card, Big Time Racketeer. This is a card that obviously cares about Battlecry type stuff, works very well with Brand. Bronzebeard is very good against Mirror Entity, allows you to have, you know, just kind of a, you know, way to play with the Battlecry effect and generating the minion straight up from the Battlecry rather than the summon. Obviously makes Moonglade Portal have a potential really bad outcome, but overall just a card that probably won't have many significant constructed implications moving forward. A card that may have significant implications, though, is Counterfeit Coin. This is a interesting card, even that it's a card that Blizzard felt like it was okay to print. This is obviously half an Innervate, which, you know, Innervate's great, so is how good is half an Innervate? Probably pretty good. But Rogue is a class that cares a lot about both the ability to play multiple cards in a turn, thanks to combo, as well as about spells, thanks to the use of Gadgetzan Auctioneer in Miracle Rogue. Lots of ways to take advantage of sort of every part of this. They really do love getting their coins off of Tomb Pillager, huge part of that as well. As to whether this is a card that will like really find a home in these competitive decks, it's tough to say. I'm certainly no Miracle Rogue expert, but my sort of experience watching these decks and commenting on people playing these decks and just seeing the lists, it feels like there's not necessarily room to just take out cards to put in these counterfeit coins very easily, because it's very easy to just totally have air at some points with these decks. You know, you already have preparation in the deck. You already have things that have to enable other things in order to do anything. There's a lot of low impact cards that you have when you're building a deck around, you know, these cheap spells in order to kind of go off with Auctioneer. And Counterfeit Coin, well, it can kind of make your nut draws better, make your best draws able to just keep going really, really quickly. But it does make the possibility that you have draws that just peter out and don't have any gas because you just draw into really low impact cards that much more likely. So it'll be interesting to see where this card sort of lands. You know, is it super good and played a lot? Is it just a card that seems like it ought to be great because Any-Man Acceleration pretty much is? Not sure, but I'm certainly interested to see people experiment with it. Probably not one I'll be trying out too much, Not really in my wheelhouse, but I'm sure it'll see some play from these Miracle Rogue experts out there. And another card that seems like it is more cool than good is Finja. I love that this is, just the Murloc Ninja here, but a couple of problems with this card. It's a 5-cost 2/4, just straight up. It's like pretty weak. Obviously, it has stealth, so it's pretty much guaranteed to get a chance to attack. The problem is that its ability requires that you attack and kill a minion. So there's going to be a lot of matchups, or at least a lot of game states, where it's very difficult for you to get significant value with Finja, because say your opponent's playing Control Warrior. You have a 5-cost 2/4 in your deck, and your opponent is just going to have very little, if anything, you're ever going to be able to attack and kill in their deck. Against Control Priest, against pretty much any rogue deck, it's very unlikely your opponent is going to just walk something into you being able to attack and kill it. It could be valuable against, decks that do have significant small minions in play, whether they're Shaman with their totems or Paladin with recruits or anything like that. In those instances, when it does get a chance to trigger, it seems very powerful. Every time it attacks, you get 2 Murlocs from your deck. That can be super strong, but it seems like it's just wildly inconsistent, not only in terms of how likely it is to come up in a given game, but how likely it's even to come up in a particular matchup. It's very likely that you just run into people who won't have any good targets for you to kill, and hard to build a deck around a card like that. Next up, we have Friendly Bartender. So this is kind of a basic, straightforward card. Just a 2/3 for 2. You heal for 1 at the end of each of your turns. Don't really see this as being a card that sees a lot of play. If you want healing effects, you generally want healing effects that are going to do a lot of healing, and usually in a big burst, because mostly what you're trying to avoid is being burst down rather than just sort of plinked down one at a time. Generally, control decks aren't going to have a lot of room to play something like a 2/3 for 2 either, simply because they're so vulnerable to getting killed by opposing War Axes and early minions, things like that. So not really a card that I expect to see a lot of play, but maybe shows up in some fringe decks. All right, this is a card that I'm kind of excited about. I think it's a neat card as a thought experiment, at least. It is Getaway Kundo. This is obviously a card kind of reminiscent of Redemption. When your minion dies, you get a chance to reuse it. But in the case of Getaway Kundo, it's kind of like half a duplicate. Obviously, half a duplicate in that it gives you 1 copy of the minion. But significantly, it is a card that allows you to reuse Battlecry effects. Like, for instance, Getaway Kundo in, let's say, Reno Paladin. You Getaway Kundo, play your Reno. If everyone kills your Reno, well, you have another Reno to work with. And that's pretty great. There's a lot of effects that are battle cries that you'd love to be able to use multiple times in a game, but can't necessarily find a great window to do or have an ability to do because, well, you can only play 1 copy of them, or it's difficult to find opportunities to reuse them. But this isn't just good with Battlecry. This is good with any minion that is particularly high impact in a matchup. Like, say, you're playing against a deck like Freeze Mage, and you have a Ragnaros, and you're able to get away Kundo and have only Ragnaros as your minions. And it's like, okay, well, they have to kill your Ragnaros. It's like, all right, well, now I have a Ragnaros again. Super powerful. Obviously works very well with Tyrion too. Any minion that is high impact enough that you can afford to spend the mana to replay it in addition to the mana from Getaway Kundo is just very, very powerful. So I think this is a really interesting card. It's obviously not the sort of tempo style play that Redemption is in a lot of instances. Obviously, you'd rather Redemption Tyrion than Getaway Kundo Tyrion because, hey, you get the Divine Shield and Ashbringer all prepackaged for just 0 additional mana once you've invested the Redemption already, whereas you have to actually pay it again for the Getaway Kundo. But more flexibility, of course, with actually getting those Battle Cry effects with this card. So definitely interesting to see if this finds a home. It creates some unique possibilities, and I'm excited about them. All right, Grook Fuu Master, 3/5 win 3/5. Meh. It's basically a slightly cheaper, slightly weaker Wind Fury Harpy. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Next up, we have I Know a Guy. Well, I think this is just a funny card. It's like, you just got to call in the big goons, call in the thugs to help you out. I like that. I think it's pretty cool. Warrior having more things that care about taunt. Maybe you're able to build that bolster deck or something like that. I don't think this is really a card that is super exciting in terms of finding a home in competitive decks. Most Warrior decks are pretty streamlined and don't necessarily want something like this unless they are, say, a actual taunt theme deck in some case. If there are more things that do care about taunt in the new set, I could see this actually finding a home because it gives you significant flexibility. I do think that cards like this are consistently undervalued. Obviously, the Journey to Underworld, the Rogue Discover a Deathrattle card, kind of was underrated very early on, but the fact that, hey, it's a cheap, flexible option that can give you, the ability to fill out your curve or the ability to find specific powerful things in a matchup can be very valuable. Though with that, it's obviously very effective too in Rogue because they care about having cheap spells, whether for Auctioneer or combo, things like that. Not really the same case for Warrior with spells or Warrior with taunt minions for that matter. Maybe it's a card that can go into Wild Pyromancer decks with Warrior with Commanding Shout, but probably not room for this kind of thing in a tight combo deck, which those generally always are. This is a card that maybe if it has the right supporting cast surrounding it, maybe there's some cool new taunt minions that are coming up in the set, could be good. More things that care about taunts could be good, but doesn't really have a home in the metagame as it seems to exist right now. All right, Kooky Chemist. Double the Crazed Alchemist, double the fun. Probably worse than Crazed Alchemist. More expensive card, doesn't have the same sort of home in, say, Zoo decks, which have life tap, care about efficiency quite a bit, can't kill a turn 2 Doomsayer. Probably not a card that's going to see a ton of play, but it is, available if you're looking for more flipping effects for your Confused deck. All right, Kun, the Forgotten King. Here it is, your 0-mana 7/7 meme. This is an interesting card because the fact that it can be a 0-mana 7/7 if you are just trying to play a significantly tempo-oriented game, need to fight back on the board, can be pretty powerful in some instances. And gain 10 armor is pretty powerful alongside a 7/7 as well. The fact that it costs 10 mana though is just a lot. This is a card that will have no impact on the game until you get to the very late stage of the game unless you ramped a ton. And what you can do with 10 mana in Hearthstone is pretty incredible. This could be Yogg-Saron, this could be N'Zoth, this could be Cthulhu. And it takes a lot to really justify playing something like that in your deck. And it seems like it's difficult for this to really get you back into a game. It doesn't have taunt or anything. It doesn't have any ability that helps you really come back if you're behind. Obviously, gaining 10 armor is powerful, but gaining 10 armor, playing a 7/7 on turn 10 isn't really that effective. You look at, say, like Ancient Shieldbearer. Ancient Shieldbearer is great. You're gaining 10 armor and you're getting a 6/6. You're doing that for 7 mana. And in a class that cares a lot about the armor because it works with Shield Slam, I don't think the sort of modality of Kun really seems like it's worth it. So this is a card that I would be surprised if it really found a home just because there's so much competition at high cost, and this doesn't feel like it does nearly enough right away. All right, Lotus Assassin. This is kind of an interesting card that I think would be great in a lot of other classes. Rogue doesn't really tend to play like a mid-range, control-y style of game, which is really what Lotus Assassin wants to do. This is a card that's great at killing your opponent's minions turn by turn. But most Rogue decks tend to be heavily tempo-oriented or combo-oriented and really want to have like big explosive turns that they power up with preparation, backstab, whatever else. And Lotus Assassin doesn't really fit into those style of decks. I do think that if there are more tools that allow rogues to have more survivability and can potentially play a more mid-range focused style, this could be a very strong card in those decks. But we don't see Stranglethorn Tiger in rogue decks these days, and this is basically a Stranglethorn Tiger that's better at controlling the board. Essentially the same at attacking your opponent's face, but better for controlling the board. And I don't imagine that is a style of rogue that's likely to get a ton of support. We haven't really seen that so far, but if it does, this is a card that could easily fit into that style of deck. All right, Lunar Visions. 5 cost, draw 2 cards, minions drawn cost 2 less. It's very difficult to justify putting this card in a deck. It competes heavily with Nourish, which if you're looking to ramp 2 big minions, obviously Lunar Vision can be good at ramping to big minions if you happen to draw big minions with your Lunar Visions. But with Nourish, you can just ramp and you can draw your 3 cards, and either mode feels like it's often going to be better at what Lunar Visions is trying to do. Maybe you're playing a deck that wants more copies of Nourish, so maybe Lunar Vision can potentially find a home there. It can be a card that can give you the ability to ramp a little bit if you need that much more ramp in your deck. But it's hard for me to justify including this in a deck when Nourish exists, I think. All right, Manic Soulcaster. This is a pretty cool card. 3/4/4/3. which is pretty valuable in Mage. There aren't necessarily in Mage that many good minions to play sort of a reasonable defensive early game with. There's obviously Spellslinger, but Spellslinger in a deck that isn't really spell synergy focused can often kind of throw off your game plan by giving your opponent additional spells and kind of messing you up. But I remember looking for a card that was a good proactive thing to play in the early turns that could still have significant impact later in the game when I was playing control mage styles of decks. And this is a card just like that. This is a card like, say you're playing Reno Mage. You play your Reno, then play your Manic Soulcaster, and now you suddenly have another Reno in your deck. It's a good card not only for potentially duplicating powerful things, get a second Kazakus in your deck if you're playing a Reno style of deck as well, but it also shuffles a card in your deck and makes you less vulnerable to fatigue. It's actually something that's come up quite a bit in a lot of my control mage-oriented decks. Since the loss of duplicate, it can sometimes be difficult because so much of your deck's card advantage mechanisms are based on actually drawing cards, and you can just end up getting deep into your deck, losing a fatigue battle, especially to, say, Control Warrior. Manic Soul Eater not only can potentially duplicate significant threats of yours or significant Battlecry minions of yours like Reno Jackson, but also adds a card to your deck in the process, which can make it better for you to be able to fight that long fatigue game. So definitely a cool card. Control Mage, absolutely my jam. Certainly looking to play this. All right, Mark of the Lotus. This is basically Power of the Wild with no choice mode. You've got to go with the version that works best with Violet Teacher. And we've seen a number of Druid cards that ask you to build big boards. This is a card that can potentially work very well alongside minions or spells that generate multiple minions for a single card. This is definitely going to go into decks that potentially only want the one mode of Power of the Wild. It can certainly go into decks that want both of them. If there are enough ways to generate significant minions early in the game, you can easily imagine powering them up multiple times with either Mark of the Lotus, Power of the Wild, or both. So certainly a card to watch out for, and particularly to keep in mind how many additional sort of token minion generators we see in the set as far as just how powerful this card can be. All right, Mean Street Marshal. This is an interesting card because it requires some help before it is even as good as Goldster Footman. But if you're able to boost it in a way that doesn't require you to invest significant resources, it's a better loot hoarder because you can come down on turn one, potentially trade with something and cycle and give you your additional card. So it'll be interesting to see if there are additional Paladin cards that help boost your early minions. Obviously, this works very well in an aggressive deck that's playing, say, Direwolf Alpha, because it can very easily just enable it right away. But if there are more things, say, Glaive Zuka style cards, or just other ways to easily boost your minions without necessarily a significant investment of resources like, say, a Blessing of Might, this could be a card that is very powerful as a tempo Paladin style of tool. Mistress of Mixtures. This is a really interesting card. Deathrattle, restore 4 health to both players. Obviously reminiscent of Zombie Chow. Less able to dominate an early board compared to Zombie Chow. And not nearly as powerful with Akanai Soul Priest as Zombie Chow, because you can kill yourself with it too if it ends up dying. But it is, a very interesting card against aggressive decks in a mid-range or controlling style of deck, because not only can it help you attack your opponent's early minions, give you some ability to stabilize the board early, but if you draw it late, it can actually just heal you, and that can be a pretty big value as well. So one of the things that's important for a lot of, say, controlling style of decks, controlling classes, is having early plays that are proactive. Like the fact that, say, Priest or Mage doesn't have access to weapons means that they can't use their early turns to play anything other than a minion that can potentially impact their opponent's future plays, because they need to actually have something their opponent has on the other side of the board in order to kill it with a spell. Mistress of Mixtures allows you to proactively play something early in the game that could potentially trade with your opponent's early plays and potentially get you back in the game later on if you draw it when you're damaged. So I think this is definitely a card that will see a significant amount of play in sort of controlling / mid-range styles of decks, particularly those that don't have access to weapons. Patches the Pirate, one of the most busted cards in the game, in top 2, as Ben Brode discovered in a Twitter epiphany apparently over the weekend. This card's pretty cool. It's a further incentive to play a aggressive pirate deck, because, whenever you play a pirate, hey, you get this guy into play. Obviously only once, because when you play him, he'll die. You don't just keep getting patches every time you play a pirate. That would be kind of busted. But definitely a incentive to play aggressive pirate into decks. Certainly makes the cards that care about you having a pirate in play, I think like Bloodsail Pirate, or whatever that one, Bloodsail Cultist, the warrior card that upgrades you if you have a pirate in play. The fact that you can get multiple pirates from a single card to give you a chance, a much better chance of having the pirate in play to upgrade your weapon with the cultist is actually a pretty big deal in terms of the power level of that style of deck. So not only do you get the 1/1 charge, but the ability to enable those I think can be quite effective in that style of deck. So certainly interested to see if this helps pirates make a resurgence, or if, the ninjas will have it with Finja. Probably not. It's going to be pirates. All right, Pilfered Power. This is basically rampant growth, or rampant growth. My magic hit background showing wild growth for each of your friendly minions. So, we saw the Mark of the Lotus before, obviously a card that wants you to play in a deck that makes a bunch of minions. This is similar, except this is a card that will, reward you in future turns for generating a bunch of minions right now. Costing 3 is pretty difficult to play this alongside something that's going to make a significant number of minions, but being able to ramp 2 or even 3 crystals seems super powerful in the right circumstances. I'm not sure if this card does generate excess mana. If you play it at 10 mana, it probably does. Astral Communion does as well. That actually does have a massive impact in terms of the power level of this card. Wild Growth is great, and you want to be able to draw Wild Growth. If you're playing a deck that is able to generate early minions, this can enable you to essentially play more copies of Wild Growth, and sometimes better Wild Growth. If you like Mire Keeper for minion, then Pilfered Power, boom, ramp for 2. It's effectively your Nourish. So it's interesting if this is able to find a home, if you can actually consistently ramp early. Going to be difficult for a lot of ramp druid decks to do that outside of, say, Living Roots, but probably not a card that will certainly supplant Wild Growth, but maybe see play in even one copy alongside it in certain decks. Piranha Launcher. This is a hilarious card. Probably not a good card is my guess, simply because 5 cost, 2/4 weapon. Going to be difficult to get a lot of value off of a 2 attack weapon at that stage of the game. I've heard some comparisons between this and Assassin's Blade in Rogue. First of all, Assassin's Blade in Rogue usually doesn't see play outside of decks that have like Blade Flurry, which you don't really see that much now, or Deadly Poison, which a hunter does not have access to. So having a lot of charges of your weapon matters if you have ways to enhance your weapon, like, say, Deadly Poison, but that's not something that's available to hunters, so a lot less impressive in that regard. Certainly a hilarious card. You're launching piranhas at people, you're getting additional bodies every time you attack. So it's definitely a high value weapon if you're able to get value off of the attacks with it, like killing minions, but coming down on 5 mana, not going to be usually that many 2 health minions around. Maybe this is a powerful card against, hunters or shamans or something, killing those small minions late in the game, who knows, but my guess is this is mostly just a cool card from a conceptual perspective that won't really see a lot of play. All right, Second Rate Bruiser. This is kind of interesting. A 4/5 taunt for 5 isn't terrible. It's not good. It's a bad rate overall, or at least like not an exciting rate. But a 4/5 taunt for 3 is certainly exciting. This is a card that anyone can potentially have access to if they're running into swarm decks like, say, Zoo, and want to have a good tool to fight back against them. And I think it's important that Hearthstone has cards like this that are obvious handholds of, hey, I'm losing to this kind of deck. My opponent's playing a bunch of minions. What do I do? It's like, well, hey, your opponent's playing a bunch of minions. Here you go. Play a cheap taunt if they have a bunch of minions in play. I don't know that this is really a card that will see a ton of play. It is worth noting that this is often going to be turned on against Shaman as well, if you're not actively attacking their totems and such. But if your opponent is generally able to have a significant board of 3 minions going into their own turn, or rather you're passing back to, it's going to be difficult for you to really prevent them from getting value with stuff like Flame Tongue, so probably not necessarily the best plan there. I'd rather kill their stuff rather than try and take advantage of the fact that they're trying to make a big board. So interesting card. Don't think it'll see a ton of competitive play because there are a lot of matchups where it's just going to be weak, but definitely a tool that I think will see people play on ladder if Swarm Depths become popular. All right, next we have Chakra the Collector. And I have to say I'm kind of disappointed in this card. I tend to look for like the good in cards, even if they're cards that don't seem particularly powerful, but this card is kind of boring. We've seen a lot of this Burgle effect out of Rogue. We've seen Swashbuckler, we've seen Burgle, we've seen Undercity Huckster, and this is just more of the same. Like, this actually is a legendary minion that just seems worse than an Undercity Huckster. Yes, there is the possibility that, it can attack several times and get you multiple cards, but most of the time, this is basically like a legendary Huckster, it feels like, because it's going to get to attack once and then die. That kind of sucks. That's kind of boring. And I just wish that we'd see something more interesting here in terms of what the Rogue class gets for its legendary for the set. So I'm disappointed, Hearthstone. I'm disappointed, team. I wish this was something cooler and wasn't just sort of a rehash of the same thing we've seen so much of from Rogue recently. Maybe if this was even like when it, deals damage or something. So maybe you can get 2 of them. Obviously, that's just a power level thing, but it just doesn't seem super cool to me. And it seems difficult for this to, you have to work to make it better than Huckster, and that feels like it sucks for a legendary. All right, small time recruits. Draw 3 1-cost minions from your deck for 3 mana. This is interesting as far as, a tempo style or aggressive style of Paladin deck is concerned, giving you a tool to refill your hand. It's kind of weird because this is competing with Divine Favor, it feels like, in that style of deck. And if your deck is full of 1-cost minions, you're probably going to be able to empty your hand quickly and get a lot of value out of Divine Favor. Maybe you're in a metagame that people are emptying their hands also pretty quickly, so you want another card draw tool that isn't requiring your opponent to have a significant number of cards in hand for you to get value out of it. I can totally buy that. This can be a very powerful card if you have a lot of utility 1-drops in your deck. You can have Abusive Sergeant, you can have the Mean Street Marshal we talked about a little bit earlier. You can have even just Argent Squire and have things that care about your Divine Shields and such. Lots of ways that you can get value out of even 1-drop minions in the sort of mid to late game. So this is definitely a card that I think is worth keeping in mind for the right deck and for the right metagame. Certainly hard to beat Divine Favor if you're just looking for raw card draw in an aggressive Paladin deck, but in the right circumstances, I could certainly see this seeing play. All right, Wicker Flame Burn Bristle, the Paladin legendary. I like that there is sort of a move to make cheaper legendary cards. There's not just huge, impressive, powerful, like 7 or 8 drop or whatever it is. We have a 3-drop legendary here. Obviously, I didn't like the 3-drop legendary in Rogue, but this one I do like. This one I think is actually pretty interesting because not only is it potentially good in like a defensively oriented Paladin deck that's just using it to kind of be a speed bump in the mid game, but it works super well with any sort of buffs. This is obviously a great guy to slap Blessing of Kings on because Divine Shield, Taunt, the lifelink effect. This is pretty huge. So this is definitely just a raw power kind of card that also has the ability to combine with other Paladin cards like buffs to make it more exciting. So certainly a card that I think we'll see play and will have a home in a lot of different Paladin decks. All right, and last, and maybe not quite least, but pretty close, Wind Up Burgle Bot. First of all, I don't like this has Burgle in the name because that's kind of become the name for a certain type of effect in Hearthstone, and it always bothers me when a name of something doesn't actually call out what that thing is. Like, it actually annoys me that the Cabal is just Cabal when there's Cabal Shadow Priest. Obviously, it's Cabal with a K, but it's like, oh, Cabal. What does it have to do with Cabal Shadow Priest? Nothing. It's a different thing. So it's kind of awkward when you just have the same lingo that exists in the game for certain things, and it gets muddled. So I don't like this as Burgle Bot. It should be something else. But anyway, I also don't really like the card. I think the card is potentially like a fine, say, arena card, where it can give you some card advantage. If you're able to get ahead, play this guy, kill your opponent's lower drop, awesome. It's not great as a play when you're behind. It's in fact pretty terrible. 5/5 or 6 is not going to be winning you any games by itself, but it definitely has the ability to further your advantage when you are ahead, which is something that is marginally valuable in a lot of circumstances in arena, but not a constructed card by any means, I don't think. Just too weak in terms of the rate you get. So anyway, that is all of the cards we've seen so far from Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. I feel like I have talked a ton, so let me know what you think of these cards in the comments, and I will be back to share with you my thoughts on the next set of reveals soon. Thanks for watching. See you next time.